The funeral of the millionaire, Charles Blake, was unlike any other. It was a rainy afternoon, and the weather seemed to reflect the somber mood of everyone present. The grand mansion, which once echoed with laughter and the hustle of a thriving business, was now filled with a tense silence. Inside, friends, family, and colleagues of Charles gathered, but the focus was not on honoring the man who had passed. No, the true drama was about to unfold in the reading of his will. Among the mourners were two women, both playing significant roles in Charles' life. His wife, Sarah, stood near the front of the room, her face pale and expressionless, though her eyes flickered with a hint of determination. Beside her, yet clearly apart from her, was his mistress, Olivia. She was dressed in black, but her demeanor was noticeably more composed than Sarah's. While Sarah clutched a handkerchief in her hands, Olivia only stared ahead, her eyes calculating. Both women knew that today wasn't just about saying goodbye to Charles. It was about securing their future. The funeral had been a quiet affair with only the closest family and friends invited. The guests in the room knew of the millionaire's fortune, his many business dealings, and the rumors about his complicated personal life. But no one knew what would happen next. The lawyer, who had worked closely with Charles over the years, was ready to read the will. He stood up, adjusting his glasses, and cleared his throat. Everyone waited for the inevitable reveal. Charles Blake had built an empire full of investments, properties, and assets in every corner of the world. It wasn't just money. It was power, influence, and wealth that would make anyone feel invincible. But now that empire had to be divided, and the question everyone was asking was, who would get what? The air in the room was thick with anticipation as the lawyer began to speak, reading Charles' final words. Sarah, the wife of the millionaire, had always assumed she would be the one to inherit everything. After all, they had been married for over 20 years, through both the good times and the bad. Despite their ups and downs, she was certain that Charles' fortune would be hers to control. Olivia, on the other hand, had another plan. For years, she had been more than just Charles' secret lover. She had invested her time, effort, and even emotions into being his confidant. She believed she was entitled to more than just a token inheritance. Her hopes were high, and she had secretly hoped that Charles would leave her a substantial share of his wealth, if not everything. As the lawyer spoke, it became clear that both women were in for a shock. Charles had written a will that none of them expected. The lawyer's voice echoed in the room as he announced that, while Sarah was named as the primary beneficiary of Charles' estate, there were conditions attached to her inheritance. The will stated that Sarah could only inherit the fortune if she fulfilled specific terms set by Charles before his death. The lawyer looked at the two women, his eyes moving from Sarah's stunned face to Olivia's surprised expression. It was clear that neither woman had expected this. But the twist didn't end there. Olivia's name was mentioned too, though not in the way she had hoped. She had been left with almost nothing, a small token amount in comparison to the enormous wealth Charles had accumulated over his lifetime. She had been excluded from the key assets, and the conditions surrounding her portion of the will made it almost impossible for her to claim anything of real value. Both Sarah and Olivia were stunned, but neither showed it. They exchanged glances, each knowing that their plans had just been thrown into disarray. The lawyer concluded the reading, and the room grew quiet. Guests whispered to each other, trying to piece together the meaning of Charles' decisions. Sarah, still processing the information, turned to look at Olivia, who stood motionless. The tension between them was palpable, but neither woman spoke a word. They knew that this was just the beginning. They would both have to decide what to do next. As the crowd began to disperse, the two women stood in the same spot, lost in their thoughts. Neither Sarah nor Olivia could shake the feeling that the real drama was only starting. The inheritance had been complicated, and neither woman would be satisfied with just a small piece of the pie. They both knew that the battle for Charles' fortune had only just begun. The reading of the will had left everyone in a stunned silence, especially Sarah and Olivia. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in as they both tried to process the lawyer's words. Sarah, still in shock, couldn't believe that Charles, her husband of over 2 decades, had left her fortune to her, only if she met certain conditions. Her mind raced. What could he have meant by that? What did he want her to do? Meanwhile, Olivia stood still, her expression unreadable. The small amount she had been left was barely enough to get by, let alone the life she had envisioned for herself after Charles' death. She had expected more, much more. The fact that she had been so clearly excluded from his true wealth filled her with a cold anger. Her mind was already spinning with plans, trying to figure out a way to challenge this. Charles had promised her so much. Was this his way of rejecting her, or was there a hidden reason behind his decision? As Sarah walked out of the room, trying to compose herself, Olivia lingered behind, her thoughts racing. She couldn't let this stand. She had to find a way to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. Sarah, despite her surprise, had the upper hand. She was the primary beneficiary, but that didn't mean Olivia was willing to give up so easily. Olivia's first move was to meet with her lawyer, a man who had helped her before with smaller matters. She needed advice on how to handle this situation, and she needed it quickly. As soon as she stepped into the lawyer's office, she began to outline her plan. "I need to know how to contest the will," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Charles made promises to me, and I won't let them slip away." The lawyer listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. "I understand your frustration," he said, "but a will is a legal document. If Charles left everything to his wife with conditions, there may not be much you can do unless you can prove there was foul play or that the conditions are unfair." Olivia wasn't deterred. She wasn't going to back down. She had spent years with Charles, and she knew more about him than anyone else. She believed she had the leverage to change things. She had to. Meanwhile, Sarah was at home, staring at the walls of her mansion, trying to make sense of the will. Her fingers trembled as she held a glass of water, not quite able to focus on anything around her. The idea of fulfilling Charles' conditions felt like a distant, impossible task. She knew he wasn't a man who made promises lightly, and the idea that she had to prove herself worthy of inheriting his fortune only seemed like another test she wasn't sure she was prepared for. What did he want her to do? What had he meant by fulfilling certain conditions? In the back of her mind, Sarah started to piece together the fragments of their life together. Charles had always been controlling, always making decisions for her. But had he really expected her to change something about herself? To prove her worthiness in a way she couldn't quite understand? The thought weighed heavily on her, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there might be something bigger at play. Charles had been distant in the final months of his life, secretive even. Perhaps there was something she didn't know. The next day, Sarah hired a private investigator. She wanted to understand what Charles had been doing in the months leading up to his death. She had to know what secrets he might have been keeping from her, and what he had expected from her. The investigator began his work immediately, combing through Charles' records, his business dealings, and any other information that might reveal more about the man she thought she knew. While Sarah was busy seeking answers, Olivia's next move was to approach the people in Charles' life who had been close to him. She began visiting his friends, his colleagues, anyone who might have insight into his true intentions. Olivia was trying to gather information, trying to find any clue that could help her prove that she deserved more. She was sure that Charles had left behind something more for her. She just needed to find it. As Sarah and Olivia embarked on their separate journeys, both women were unaware of the twists ahead. The millionaire's legacy, the fortune that both sought so desperately, was not as straightforward as either of them thought. Every move they made was leading them down a path filled with new challenges, and neither woman knew just how far they would have to go to get what they wanted. The battle for Charles' wealth was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The search for answers continued for both Sarah and Olivia, but the deeper they dug, the more complicated things became. For Sarah, the private investigator's findings were unsettling. Charles had always been a man of business, but now Sarah was learning things she had never imagined. The investigator revealed that Charles had been involved in a series of secretive deals, investments, and business ventures that she had never been told about. There were properties she had no idea existed, offshore accounts that weren't mentioned in their conversations, and connections to people she had never met. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed as though Charles had been living a double life, one that was hidden from her for reasons she couldn't yet understand. Each new piece of information felt like a puzzle that was only getting more confusing. The mansion they had shared together, the house full of memories, now felt like a hollow shell. It was as though Charles had been preparing for something. But what? Was he expecting trouble, or was there a plan she had missed? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Charles had never been a man to leave things to chance. He had always been in control. So why had he made the conditions of the will so complicated? What was his true intention? As the investigator continued to dig into the millionaire's past, Sarah began to piece together some startling facts. Charles had been in touch with several foreign business partners in the weeks leading up to his death, and his private meetings with them had been frequent and urgent. The investigator also uncovered evidence of a recent change in Charles' will, just months before his death. It seemed that Charles had been making decisions in a rush, but Sarah couldn't figure out why. What had triggered such urgency? And why had he hidden all of this from her? Meanwhile, Olivia was pursuing her own line of questioning. While Sarah turned inward, looking into Charles' business dealings, Olivia focused on the people in Charles' life. She reached out to his friends, his associates, and anyone who had worked closely with him. Olivia needed answers, but she wasn't getting what she wanted. Most of the people she contacted were unwilling to share any information, likely due to the respect they had for Charles. But Olivia wasn't ready to give up yet. One afternoon, Olivia received a phone call from someone unexpected, a former employee of Charles who had been close to him in the years before his death. This person, a man named Marcus, claimed to have information about Charles' final days. Olivia listened carefully as Marcus explained that Charles had become increasingly secretive in his last months. He had even mentioned that his wife, Sarah, wasn't aware of everything he had been doing. Olivia listened intently, her mind racing. Was this the break she had been waiting for? Marcus hinted that Charles had been planning something significant, but he wouldn't reveal all the details without a price. Olivia was intrigued, but hesitant. She knew that if she could get the full picture, it might change everything. After some negotiation, Olivia agreed to meet Marcus in person to get more information. The deal was set, and Olivia felt a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could still turn the tables in her favor. But as Olivia prepared to meet with Marcus, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was walking into a trap. Was Marcus genuinely offering helpful information, or was he trying to manipulate her into doing something reckless? Despite her doubts, Olivia was determined to move forward. She was on the verge of learning something important, and she couldn't afford to back down now. Back at home, Sarah was facing her own challenges. As she continued to search for answers, she felt a growing sense of isolation. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in on her, and the pressure of the will's conditions weighed heavily on her. How could she prove herself worthy of Charles' fortune when she didn't even understand the full extent of his life? The more she uncovered, the more questions she had, and the more confused she became. As Sarah and Olivia embarked on their separate journeys, both women were unaware of the twists ahead. The millionaire's legacy, the fortune that both sought so desperately, was not as straightforward as either of them thought. Every move they made was leading them down a path filled with new challenges, and neither woman knew just how far they would have to go to get what they wanted. The battle for Charles' wealth was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The search for answers continued for both Sarah and Olivia, but the deeper they dug, the more complicated things became. For Sarah, the private investigator's findings were unsettling. Charles had always been a man of business, but now Sarah was learning things she had never imagined. The investigator revealed that Charles had been involved in a series of secretive deals, investments, and business ventures that she had never been told about. There were properties she had no idea existed, offshore accounts that weren't mentioned in their conversations, and connections to people she had never met. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed as though Charles had been living a double life, one that was hidden from her for reasons she couldn't yet understand. Each new piece of information felt like a puzzle that was only getting more confusing. The mansion they had shared together, the house full of memories, now felt like a hollow shell. It was as though Charles had been preparing for something. But what? Was he expecting trouble, or was there a plan she had missed? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Charles had never been a man to leave things to chance. He had always been in control. So why had he made the conditions of the will so complicated? What was his true intention? As the investigator continued to dig into the millionaire's past, Sarah began to piece together some startling facts. Charles had been in touch with several foreign business partners in the weeks leading up to his death, and his private meetings with them had been frequent and urgent. The investigator also uncovered evidence of a recent change in Charles' will, just months before his death. It seemed that Charles had been making decisions in a rush, but Sarah couldn't figure out why. What had triggered such urgency? And why had he hidden all of this from her? Meanwhile, Olivia was pursuing her own line of questioning. While Sarah turned inward, looking into Charles' business dealings, Olivia focused on the people in Charles' life. She reached out to his friends, his associates, and anyone who had worked closely with him. Olivia needed answers, but she wasn't getting what she wanted. Most of the people she contacted were unwilling to share any information, likely due to the respect they had for Charles. But Olivia wasn't ready to give up yet. One afternoon, Olivia received a phone call from someone unexpected, a former employee of Charles who had been close to him in the years before his death. This person, a man named Marcus, claimed to have information about Charles' final days. Olivia listened carefully as Marcus explained that Charles had become increasingly secretive in his last months. He had even mentioned that his wife, Sarah, wasn't aware of everything he had been doing. Olivia listened intently, her mind racing. Was this the break she had been waiting for? Marcus hinted that Charles had been planning something significant, but he wouldn't reveal all the details without a price. Olivia was intrigued, but hesitant. She knew that if she could get the full picture, it might change everything. After some negotiation, Olivia agreed to meet Marcus in person to get more information. The deal was set, and Olivia felt a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could still turn the tables in her favor. But as Olivia prepared to meet with Marcus, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was walking into a trap. Was Marcus genuinely offering helpful information, or was he trying to manipulate her into doing something reckless? Despite her doubts, Olivia was determined to move forward. She was on the verge of learning something important, and she couldn't afford to back down now. Back at home, Sarah was facing her own challenges. As she continued to search for answers, she felt a growing sense of isolation. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in on her, and the pressure of the will's conditions weighed heavily on her. How could she prove herself worthy of Charles' fortune when she didn't even understand the full extent of his life? The more she uncovered, the more questions she had, and the more confused she became. Marcus told Olivia that Charles had been concerned about his wealth being taken by people he didn't trust. This included Sarah, whom Charles seemed to have grown distant from, and even Olivia, who had never fully been accepted into his inner circle. Marcus revealed that Charles had been setting up secret accounts and using various legal loopholes to protect his fortune. There was even talk of an offshore trust that would keep his wealth out of reach from anyone who might try to lay claim to it. Olivia's eyes gleamed with excitement. This was the kind of information she had been waiting for. The fact that Charles had gone to such lengths to protect his fortune meant that there was something worth fighting for, something she could still claim. But as Marcus spoke, Olivia began to realize that this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about proving something to herself, about showing Charles that she wasn't just another woman in his life. She was someone who had always been a part of his grand plan. But as the conversation went on, Marcus dropped a bombshell that caught Olivia off guard. He hinted that there were even more surprises hidden within Charles' final arrangements. Things that no one, not even Sarah, was aware of. He suggested that if Olivia was truly serious about claiming what she believed was hers, she would have to act quickly and decisively. The clock was ticking, and every moment brought her closer to either securing her future or losing everything. Back at home, Sarah was beginning to understand the weight of the situation. The more she thought about the letters, the more she realized that Charles had been preparing her for something bigger than just managing wealth. He had been preparing her for a test of character, one that would determine whether she could truly rise to the challenge of handling his legacy. But she wasn't sure if she was ready. The world she thought she understood was rapidly changing, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The pressure was mounting for both Sarah and Olivia, each facing their own set of challenges as they sought to claim the fortune that they both believed should rightfully be theirs. For Sarah, the realization that Charles had left behind a complex web of investments, secret dealings, and hidden intentions was overwhelming. The letters had revealed so much, yet there was still so much more to uncover. Every piece of information she found seemed to lead to another question, another mystery that needed solving. She had come to a point where she wasn't just trying to inherit a fortune. She was trying to understand the man she had lived with for so long. Had she truly known Charles, or had she been living with a stranger for all these years? Meanwhile, Olivia had begun to act on the new information she had received from Marcus. She felt more confident now, armed with knowledge that could give her an edge. Marcus had opened her eyes to the fact that Charles had been more guarded than anyone had realized, and that his wealth was protected in ways she hadn't even imagined. As she sat in her apartment, flipping through the documents Marcus had handed her, she could feel her pulse quicken. This was it, the key to unlocking everything she had ever wanted. But Marcus had warned her that she couldn't waste any time. If she wanted to challenge the will and gain access to Charles' true fortune, she would have to act swiftly. Olivia had already begun making calls, reaching out to lawyers and financial experts who could help her navigate the maze of legalities that lay ahead. But as she was planning her next move, a troubling thought lingered in the back of her mind. What if Sarah had already figured it out? What if she was already a step ahead? The tension between the two women was growing, and neither of them knew just how deep the rivalry would go. Olivia, with her newfound knowledge, was preparing to fight for what she believed was hers. But Sarah, now understanding that Charles had left her with more than just money to inherit, was also preparing herself for a challenge. She couldn't ignore the growing feeling that Charles had wanted her to prove her worth, to show that she could handle the immense responsibility of his wealth. It was more than just financial. It was about trust, strength, and resilience. But Sarah wasn't sure if she could meet those demands. Charles had always been the one in control, and now it seemed that he had left her with a test she wasn't prepared for. In the weeks that followed, both women found themselves in a race against time. Olivia, feeling more determined than ever, set her sights on the offshore accounts Charles had established. She knew that these accounts held the key to his real fortune, and if she could somehow gain access to them, she would be able to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. She enlisted the help of a lawyer who specialized in international trusts, a man known for his ability to navigate complex legal systems. Together, they began to investigate the legal framework Charles had put in place to protect his wealth. It was a complicated process, full of twists and turns, but Olivia was confident that she could find a way in. Meanwhile, Sarah's investigation into Charles' final days had taken another turn. The private investigator had uncovered more details about the millionaire's secret business dealings, but there was one thing that stood out to her. Charles had been meeting with people she had never heard of before. These meetings seemed to have been about far more than just business. They were personal. Sarah found herself wondering if Charles had been preparing for something, and whether those meetings had anything to do with his will. She couldn't help but think that perhaps he had been trying to prepare her for a future without him, one that would require her to stand on her own. As Sarah continued to dig into the mystery of Charles' life, she found herself questioning everything she had once taken for granted. Had she truly understood the man she had married? Or had she been so wrapped up in her own life that she had missed the signs of something larger, something far beyond her comprehension? The more she learned, the more she realized that she had to make a choice, to either rise to the challenge Charles had left for her or to walk away from it all. The rivalry between Sarah and Olivia was only growing more intense. Olivia, with her lawyer and the information Marcus had provided, was confident that she could break through the barriers Charles had set up. But Sarah, armed with the letters and the investigators' findings, wasn't willing to give up so easily. The stakes had been set, and now it was a matter of who would outsmart the other. As the weeks passed, the pressure on both women intensified. Olivia pushed forward with her legal battle, determined to gain control of the fortune she believed was hers. Meanwhile, Sarah faced a personal challenge like no other. The weight of Charles' legacy was on her shoulders, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to carry it. Both women were navigating a complex game of strategy, but neither knew how it would all end. The competition between Sarah and Olivia was now more than just a contest for wealth. It was a battle for power, control, and the future they both thought they had secured. Neither woman was willing to back down, and each knew that only one of them would emerge victorious in the end. But as the story unfolded, it became clear that neither of them could have predicted the shocking twists that lay ahead. The days were growing longer, and the tension between Sarah and Olivia only deepened as both women pushed forward with their plans. Neither of them had expected the will to be so complicated, nor had they anticipated the intensity of the battle they now found themselves in. Olivia, armed with the legal advice she had gathered, had begun to take action. She filed a petition to challenge Charles' will, confident that she could find a way to access his hidden assets, especially the offshore accounts. She had spent hours in meetings with her lawyer, drafting documents and analyzing every loophole she could exploit. Olivia believed that Charles had never intended for her to be left out entirely. There had to be a mistake, or an oversight, in the will that she could exploit. As she prepared for the legal battle ahead, Olivia felt a growing sense of urgency. Time was running out, and she knew that the longer Sarah held on to her claim, the harder it would be to fight for what she thought was hers. Yet, despite the growing anxiety, Olivia couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. She had come this far, and now, she believed, was the moment she could secure her future. Sarah, on the other hand, found herself struggling with the weight of her discoveries. The letters Charles had left behind continued to haunt her thoughts. They revealed things she hadn't known about their marriage, secrets about his doubts and his fears, things he had never shared with her during their years together. As she sat alone in her study, staring at the papers, Sarah felt more distant from the man she had thought she knew. Charles' true feelings about their relationship and his thoughts on her ability to handle his legacy left her feeling exposed, vulnerable. The more Sarah uncovered, the more she realized how much Charles had been preparing for the future without her. Had he truly doubted her abilities all along, or was he simply trying to push her into a position of strength, forcing her to rise to the occasion? The questions plagued her, and each time she came closer to an answer, it seemed to slip further away. The terms of the will, the hidden assets, the secret meetings, it was all overwhelming. But there was something about Charles' careful planning that suggested he had believed in her potential, even if he hadn't shown it in the way she had hoped. The private investigator continued to dig into Charles' business dealings, and the more he uncovered, the more Sarah began to see a pattern. Charles had made sure that his wealth was divided in a way that no one could easily claim it. The will had been just one layer of protection. The other layers were in offshore trusts, hidden bank accounts, and legal strategies designed to ensure that only someone who truly understood the intricacies of his empire could access it. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. Charles had built something that no one, not even Sarah, could take for granted. To inherit his wealth, she would have to prove she could navigate the complexities of his world. Sarah began to realize that the challenge wasn't just about meeting Charles' conditions. It was about learning his way of thinking, understanding his vision for the future, and proving that she could carry it forward. The thought was both daunting and empowering. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a flicker of determination. She wasn't sure if she could ever truly live up to the high standards Charles had set, but she knew she couldn't back down now. His wealth, his legacy, depended on her ability to rise to the challenge. And if that meant learning new things, taking risks, and stepping outside her comfort zone, then that was exactly what she would do. As Sarah moved forward with her investigation, Olivia's own plans were gaining momentum. Her lawyer had found a potential flaw in the terms of the will, something that could be used to challenge Charles' wishes. The flaw, however, was complicated. It wasn't a simple matter of a mistake in the document, but rather a technicality in the way the will had been written. Olivia's team had to carefully construct a case that would show how the will's instructions were unclear or unfair. The process was slow, but Olivia was growing more confident. She knew that if she could just get the right legal leverage, she could turn the situation in her favor. Yet, as Olivia pushed forward, she began to realize that she wasn't just fighting for money. This was becoming personal. Charles had never truly committed to her in the way she had hoped, and now she was faced with the realization that she had been excluded from his most important assets. Olivia had spent years hoping that Charles would choose her, that he would make her an integral part of his legacy. Now, it seemed that hope was fading, and Olivia was left fighting for what she believed she deserved. Both women were now locked in a game of strategy, each trying to outmaneuver the other. Sarah, with her growing understanding of Charles' empire, was working to meet the conditions of the will, determined to prove that she could handle the weight of his legacy. Olivia, with her legal team and newfound knowledge, was preparing to challenge the very will that Sarah was trying to fulfill. The stakes were high, and neither woman was willing to give up without a fight. The more they each worked, the more they realized that this battle wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and the future. The legacy of Charles Blake would not be handed over easily, and as the days went by, both women understood that only one of them could emerge victorious. The final outcome was uncertain, but one thing was clear: neither Sarah nor Olivia was willing to back down. The fight for Charles' fortune had only just begun. The tension between Sarah and Olivia reached its peak as the days dragged on. Both women were deep in their respective battles, unaware of the ultimate twist that fate had in store for them. Sarah had been working tirelessly to understand Charles' complex web of investments, legal arrangements, and offshore accounts. She had hired experts, financial advisors, and even an attorney who specialized in trusts. It was clear to Sarah that Charles had spent the final years of his life preparing for something monumental. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized how little she truly knew about the man she had married. Every new discovery felt like a door opening to a world that was completely foreign to her. Her focus, though, was now on fulfilling the conditions of the will. Charles had made it clear that she could only inherit his fortune if she proved herself capable of managing it. The challenge was daunting, but Sarah was determined not to fail. The idea of losing everything, her home, her lifestyle, and her sense of security, was more than she could bear. The legacy of Charles' empire was now in her hands, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Meanwhile, Olivia wasn't sitting idle. Her legal team was moving quickly, poring over the details of Charles' will. They had discovered the technicality in the will that could give Olivia an edge. According to the legal documents, there were ambiguous terms that could be interpreted in her favor. Olivia's lawyer was confident that they could challenge the will in court, but Olivia knew that time was running out. She had been living in the shadows of Sarah's inheritance for too long. She wanted what she believed was rightfully hers, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way. The battle had now shifted to the courtroom, and both women were on a collision course. Sarah had already begun working on the conditions set by Charles, doing everything in her power to meet his expectations. The more she delved into his world, the more she felt connected to him, though in a way that was both empowering and painful. She found herself thinking about the times they had spent together, both the good and the bad. Had he ever truly trusted her? Had their marriage been a partnership, or had it been a carefully constructed arrangement? Olivia, on the other hand, was preparing her case with a singular focus. She wasn't interested in the emotional aspects of the situation. She was determined to win. She believed that the estate should be hers, not Sarah's. Olivia had spent years being sidelined, and now she was ready to claim her place in Charles' legacy. Her lawyer had been working on the legal challenge, and they were preparing to file a petition in court. It wasn't going to be easy, but Olivia was confident that the law was on her side. She had always been a fighter, and this was no different. As the days passed, Sarah continued her work to meet the conditions of Charles' will. One of the requirements was to reconnect with people from Charles' past, people who had known him when he was at the height of his success. She attended meetings, visited old colleagues, and began to uncover more about the man Charles had been before his health declined. Some of the people she met were helpful, while others were distant and cold, seemingly uninterested in her efforts. But with each meeting, Sarah felt herself gaining more confidence. She was beginning to understand why Charles had set these conditions. It wasn't just about the money. It was about proving that she could navigate the world he had built and keep it intact. Olivia, however, was relentless. She knew that the courtroom battle would be her final opportunity to claim what she believed was hers. She spent every waking moment preparing, gathering evidence, and strategizing with her lawyer. There were moments when doubt crept in, moments when she questioned whether Charles had truly wanted her to inherit anything at all. But those moments were fleeting. Olivia knew that this was her chance to take control of her life, and she wasn't going to waste it. She was prepared to fight with everything she had, even if it meant going head-to-head with Sarah. The day of the court hearing arrived, and both women were ready. Sarah stood in front of the judge, her heart pounding, as she presented the steps she had taken to fulfill Charles' conditions. She spoke confidently, but there was a nervousness as the courtroom session continued. The air became thick with tension. Both women had their eyes set on the prize, but neither could know how it would all unfold. The judge listened to both sides, weighing the arguments, and the room fell into a hush. Both Sarah and Olivia were playing for the biggest stakes of their lives. Neither would back down, and neither would let the other win without a fight. The battle for Charles' legacy was about to reach its boiling point, and neither woman was prepared to lose. The courtroom was silent as the judge deliberated, each word weighing heavily on the minds of Sarah and Olivia. They both sat in their respective places, their eyes locked on the judge, waiting for the decision that would change their futures. It had been a long and exhausting battle, and the tension in the room was palpable. For weeks, they had fought, Sarah working tirelessly to fulfill Charles' conditions, Olivia maneuvering through the legal complexities, each woman believing that she was the rightful heir to Charles' legacy. The judge, an older man with a stern face, cleared his throat before speaking. After careful review of the case, the evidence presented, and the intentions outlined in the will, I have reached a decision. Both Sarah and Olivia held their breath. Sarah's hands were clenched in her lap, her mind racing as she thought about everything she had gone through to get here. Every meeting, every document, every sleepless night. It had all led to this moment. She had given everything to prove that she was capable of handling the responsibility Charles had left behind. But now, as the judge's words loomed over her, doubt crept in. Had she done enough? Had she truly understood what Charles had wanted from her? On the other side of the room, Olivia sat with a look of determination on her face. She had worked just as hard, if not harder, to claim what she felt was rightfully hers. The legal battle had been grueling, but she had been relentless. She had always believed that Charles had wanted her to be a part of his legacy, that he had promised her a place by his side. Now, as she waited for the final ruling, all those years of effort seemed to hang in the balance. Would it finally pay off? The judge's voice